session after the lunch. We will have 5 presentations still today in the afternoon. I would like to ask Csilla Stenger-Kovács from the Limnology Research Group, University of Pannonia, Veszprém, Hungary, to provide her presentation, Effect on Land Use on Streams, Traditional and Functional Analysis of Benthic Diatoms. Csilla, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation, and I'm very happy that I can talk a bit about the streams and their microscopic features. What is the situation in our waters? So, among the numerous anthropogenic activities, agricultural land use and urbanization seriously threaten the aquatic ecosystems. Water basins are degraded by the conversion of natural forests, pasture lands to agricultural areas with intensive application of herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers. On the other side, there are the urban settlements where the population density is high. The inflows from industrial and domestic sewage and modification of the riparian zone is characteristic. Moreover, the artificial surfaces in these settlements is continuously increasing. So this complex effect can lead to the loss of biodiversity in streams and lakes, and can lead to the homogenization of aquatic communities. We know very well that diatoms are good indicators of the catchment land use and agricultural activities. So they can serve as good proxy for eutrophication or urbanization. But earlier studies, diatomological studies, focused on mostly on species-based community analysis. And in spite of their great number, the knowledge about the complex effect of the agricultural land use and urbanization remained a big challenge. Functional analysis can offer a new way to reveal these complex effects and can offer a robust and more robust and ecological meaningful knowledge about these processes. And it has several advantages. For example, they can be used independently from ecoregions, and they are easier and faster than the identification of the diatom species. In this small study, we examined the effect of the catchment scale land use and environmental variables on the species and trait composition of diatoms. We determined the pure and shared effects of the environmental variables and land use form, also on the species composition, trait composition, and species richness and functional diversity. With the linear models, we tried to clarify the relationship between the traits and land use forms. And beside the catchment scale effect of the urbanization, we try to examine the local effect and to highlight the local effect of the urbanization in streams. For this analysis, we selected 75 sampling sites from different streams in Hungary. We collected these sampling sites from our database. And the base of the selection was that the position of the stream sites. So the sampling sites was ideal. I try to show. if the sampling point was positioned at the end of the downstream section, because in this point, this site can represent all of the anthropogenic pressure which can be found on the catchment basin. We measured several water chemical variables in the field and in the laboratory, and we made the traditional analysis of diatoms. We identified them to species level, and we applied the functional analysis. Here in this table, you can see the applied traits regarding diatom ecological yields, cell biovolume, and length and width ratio. We combined these traits as ecomorphological groups, and we used these groups in our trait-based analysis. Altogether, 5 different land use forms were employed in this study: forest and semi-natural areas, water bodies, artificial surfaces, wetlands, and agricultural areas. The independently land use forms and their extension were determined by the quantum GIS software. And the results, we could identify the clear effect of the different land use forms and the environmental variables, both on the species composition of diatoms and the trait abundance. But I have to notice that in case of the functional analysis, this effect was more pronounced. After forward selection of the redundancy models, we got that results that concerning the environmental variables, conductivity, pH, bicarbonate, sulfate, nitrate, and nitrate were the most important constraints for the species composition. But in case of the trait abundance, these environmental variables were other variables like conductivity, pH, nitrate, and silica. So here you can see that the species composition and the trait composition was completely had completely different sensitivity for the different environmental variables. The variation partitioning analysis revealed the significant pure effect of the environmental variables in case of the relative abundance of the species, the trait abundance, and the species richness, in contrast with the functional diversity, functional richness, where the land use had significant effect on it. This land use means that the agricultural area and the forest and the proportion of the forest area were the most significant factors which had effect on the functional diversity. We developed several linear models to try to find the relationship between the different land use form and traits. And we got real nice results. For example, in forests, which is a very controlled environment by shedding, for example, or by trees, which can keep back the water and the nutrients. So in this controlled environment, the low profile yield and the small cell size species are characteristic. Because the low profile yield can indicate the low nutrients as well as the small cell size. And here we can get a very simple community structure and low functional richness. In the case of that water basins where the water surfaces were in bigger amount, or the artificial part of the water basin, here the low profile gild and the second category of the length-width ratio were dominant. What does it mean? The more water surfaces enable the quick spread of the different algal species, and the artificial surfaces can accelerate the runoffs, where the species with this low profile feature and slightly elongated shape can dominate. These artificial surfaces can open a new way for the invasive species in these urban areas, and that invasive species which have similar traits, so this low profile gild and slightly elongated shape. If you remember, in the reduced redundancy analysis model, we couldn't detect the catchment scale effect of the urbanization. And when we examined the local effect of this, we found similar results. So the local effect is also negligible in this concern. The reason for this can be on catchment scale that the artificial surfaces in these catchment basins are still in small amount. So this area is only around 1.5%, in contrast with the agricultural areas, which is more than 55%. And in case of the local effect, the reason can be that diatoms are less sensitive for these artificial surfaces, because these surfaces are neutral and very similar to their natural surfaces, substratum surfaces, like stone or cobbles. And this is our paper, and more details you can find in this paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the nice presentation. We have time for questions. Okay, during your thinking, I would like to know, I was not clear for me, so you used artificial substrate types in these studies, so you placed out something artificial surfaces? No, just... We
estimated the artificial surfaces in the catchment basins, so roads, roofs, parking places.
Mm-hmm. So you have sampled in these catchments the maturated biofilm of these diatoms. My question would be that if it would be interesting to see how the colonization processes in different catchments how occur, how influence these different type of drivers. Do you have in mind to develop such a project later on, or do you have such a project?
No, we don't have such kind of project, but I'm sure that this complex effect can really affect the colonization process. So, which will be the first colonizers, how will change the community in really short time. It depends on the environmental variables, the different environmental factors like shedding or any other.
Okay, are there questions? I also check the questions here in the chat. I also encourage the audience, in remote audience, also ask questions in the field. There is a delay between the response and the current state of the... Okay, if there is not, then I thank you for your kind presentation, and we move to the next presentation by Veronika Bókony, Department of Evolutionary Ecology, Plant Protection Institute, Center for Agricultural Research, Eötvös Loránd Research Network, Budapest, Hungary. And she will talk about evolutionary ecology of anthropogenic habitat conversion in amphibians, stress and sex. So it will be interesting presentation, I think.
Thank you, Péter. And good afternoon, everyone. After all these great talks, mostly about community ecology, I would like to turn your attention now to evolutionary ecology. So let's zoom in from the level of ecosystems, communities, and species traits to individual traits within species, like Federico did a bit at the end of his talk about birds. So I think several presentations now have mentioned that urbanization is associated with a multitude of environmental changes, including changes in the physical, chemical environment, biotic changes. And all these environmental changes are often accompanied by differences between urban and non-urban conspecifics, including changes in morphology, physiology, life history, behavior, etc. And these changes may or may not be adaptive. And these changes, some of them happen during the lifetime of the individuals by phenotypic plasticity, while some others happen through microevolution within the urban habitats, in which latter case, the urban and non-urban populations will differ not only phenotypically, but also genetically. There are some further mechanisms as well, which are, some of them are not even shown on this graph, but these two are the main mechanisms by which organisms may adapt to urban life. And finding out which mechanism drives which changes is important not only for a general understanding of urban ecology or evolutionary ecology in general, but also for trying to inform conservation efforts. For example, if we can find out if certain changes are already fixed or not genetically, this could be relevant for deciding if certain urban habitats could serve as conservation hotspots in the future, or if instead they serve as ecological traps. If you look at the literature of urban ecology in general, the picture you see is quite similar to the spectrum of today's presentations. So most studies are being done on terrestrial ecosystems. And if you find an aquatic study, it's usually about community ecology, so less so about evolutionary ecology. So I would like to address this gap a little bit in my talk by showing you a few examples, just in a nutshell, from my research on amphibians. This is the most endangered group of vertebrate animals, and they're important for both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. For example, their larvae can control eutrophication, their adults can eat a lot of pest insects. They're important for conservation for so many reasons. And so how do amphibians cope with urbanization? Which individual traits do they change, and how do they achieve those changes? We studied these broad questions in these two species with my group at the Department of Evolutionary Ecology. The two species are the common toad and the agile frog. Both are quite widespread in Europe, but some localized declines have been observed in both species recently. And if you think about all those environmental changes associated typically with urban habitats, a common aspect in those changes is that they can trigger physiological stress in animals. And vertebrates, at least, can deal with such physiological stressors by a generalized hormonal stress response, which obviously helps coping with the acute stress, but it can also be costly or harmful if the stressors are too frequent or if they last too long. So it's not trivial how urban animals should manage their stress hormone levels. So we measured these stress hormone levels in toad tadpoles in 3 different kinds of habitat: urban habitats, agricultural habitats, and ponds in natural habitats. And we took 3 samples from each individual: 1 baseline stress hormone level, 1 stressed level after applying a standardized acute stressor by shaking the animals, and then a recovery sample after 1 hour without any kind of disturbance. And from these data, we found that the tadpoles, both living in the urban ponds and in the agricultural ponds, had significantly stronger stress response and faster recovery, which you can see from this graph from the blue and the brown lines having both a steeper upslope and the steeper downslope compared to the green line, which is the natural habitat. So this sounds like a good strategy in anthropogenic habitats, where you probably have to respond to stressors frequently, but you also want to shut that response down quite quickly in order to prevent the potential harm associated with high stress hormone levels. Additionally, we also found that the urban tadpoles had higher baseline stress hormone levels, which is probably adaptive for them in dealing with the metabolic challenges associated with urban life, like high temperatures, which I'm going to talk about a bit more later. Okay, but besides these more generalized responses, there could be more specialized defenses against certain kinds of stressors, for example, against predators, parasites, and pathogens. Toads produce toxic chemicals, which they store in their skin, mostly in this huge gland called the parotoid. And when we measured the size of this gland in the 3 habitat types, we found that it was significantly larger in both the urban and the agricultural habitats compared to the natural habitats. We also took a toxin sample from each toad and measured its chemical composition, which can be grouped into the less toxic bufatoxins and the more toxic bufagenins. And this is a tricky graph because we had a lot of different chemical compounds, so we had to analyze them with meta-analyses. And so here the horizontal dotted line represents the natural habitat. And this error bar, for example, in brown, is the difference between the agricultural and the natural habitat in the overall concentration of bufatoxins. And this difference here is not significant because the error bar overlaps the dashed line, which is the reference line. But for the more poisonous bufagenins, we found that the toads, both from the urban and agricultural habitats, had significantly higher overall concentrations than the toads from the natural habitats. So this suggests that they have more and stronger defensive toxins in the anthropogenic habitats, which probably has to do something with the altered predatory fauna and probably different disease dynamics in the anthropogenic habitats. There could be also specialized defenses against heat, which is also more frequent in urban habitats due to the urban heat island effect. For example, in this graph, you can see the water temperature in 3 urban and 3 non-urban ponds, and the encircled red part is a heat wave. And these temperatures observed in the urban ponds are actually pretty close to what the tadpoles can tolerate without dying for this many days. So we collected agile frog tadpoles from these 6 ponds, and we measured their critical thermal maximum, which is the high temperature at which they stop responding to the environment. It's practically like fainting. And we found that the urban tadpoles had significantly higher heat tolerance than the non-urban tadpoles, which again sounds an adaptive response to these hotter environments. And all these traits that we measured, so stress hormone levels, chemical defenses, and heat tolerance, we also measured them in common garden experiments in which we collected eggs from different habitats and raised them together in the same environment, either in the lab inside or in outdoors mesocosms. And in these experiments, we found none of those phenotypic differences that we detected in the free-living animals. So this points to the role of phenotypic plasticity. And I think this sounds like good news because it suggests that the urban frogs and toads can deal with the challenges of urban life by relatively reversible and rapid phenotypic changes. But phenotypic plasticity can also have its costs. Let me show you an example here. In toads, we found that the females captured from the agricultural and the urban habitats produced more jelly around their eggs. This is a protective layer which is supposed to protect the eggs from a lot of outside disturbances, and it may also protect them from pollutants. But if we, or when we raise the tadpoles from the same females in the same environment, in a common garden experiment, we found that these offspring took longer to develop and they had smaller body masses if the mother was from the anthropogenic habitats. Now, we don't know the exact cause of this difference, but it is possible that the females traded off the nutrients they should have put into the eggs for more jelly for protecting the offspring, for example, from pollution. And I wanted to show you one more example about the potential harm associated with urbanization and phenotypic responses to urbanization, which is sex reversal in amphibians. This means that in response to early life stressors, sex development can be disrupted in these animals, and it can result in a permanent lifelong mismatch between genetic sex and phenotypic sex. And when we studied this in agile frogs, we found that 20% of phenotypically male adult frogs were genetically female in different populations in Hungary. And this ratio increased with the degree of urbanization and anthropogenic cover at the different habitats. And when we produced sex-reversed individuals by applying a heat wave treatment to tadpoles during their early development, we found that these sex-reversed individuals had slower development and growth, less fat reserves for winter survival, and they had a higher incidence of abnormal reproductive organs. So these are really not good news for individual fitness prospects, although we don't know yet if the case is similar for the free-living frogs, sex-reversed frogs. So to very quickly sum it up, we found several phenotypic differences between urban and non-urban toads and frogs, which seem to be driven by developmental plasticity. They seem to be adaptive, well, we didn't test for that yet, but it seems that they could have also fitness costs, which definitely deserve more research attention in the future. And it also seems that not all of these phenotypic changes are adaptive in urban habitats. At least we found that sex reversal was more frequent in urban habitats, and it seems to go hand in hand with reduced fitness prospects. And that could obviously have a negative effect on population sizes, and also it could lead to male-biased sex ratios in the free-living populations, which then may further decrease the effective population sizes. So this is definitely something that's worth more studies in the future, also from a conservation perspective. Okay. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the presentation, and we have time for questions. Okay, Peter.
Thank you for the nice talk. So it's good to see that amphibians can adapt, maybe, although for the cost of changed sex ratio. Do you see any mitigation possibilities in urban settings to support them?
Mitigation of what?
Mitigation of against the urbanization process, like having deeper, larger ponds or shady ponds, or I don't know.
Right, so like habitat construction.
Yes,
right. So
whatever.
A huge threat for urban populations is obviously the collision and roadkill by cars and other kind of vehicles when they're migrating to and from the breeding ponds. And this is very difficult to manage. There are some very good examples from local efforts, so bottom-up efforts by the local communities trying to save the populations. In this respect, I can imagine very little coming from the top down. But in general, conserving these very little, often neglected aquatic habitats in both kinds of anthropogenic habitats could be very important for them, especially as we go along with climate change.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? Yeah, I thought for a moment, as Peter asked, that prevent frogs, female frogs looks like a male. So I was a bit. So why is it that? So why is it important to have more characteristics to be a male for a female frog?
Why is it important to them?
Yep.
I don't think it is. I don't think it's adaptive. I think that one is a constraint, so that the consequence of their very exposed larval development. So everything goes in, chemicals goes in. They are also very sensitive to heat. So the heat island effect, and both heat and chemical disruption can lead to this sex reversal I mentioned. Theoretically, it could be adaptive to change your sex in response to the environmental conditions. And sex reversal could be a mechanism, an evolutionary mechanism to achieve such. It's like temperature-dependent sex determination, if that rings a bell. But in this case, it's an interesting question, and we would like to study it in the field if it's adaptive, but so far what we see doesn't suggest that it's adaptive. So it really looks like a harmful, potentially harmful byproduct of urban pollution or the heat island effect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for the answer. Are there further questions? I check also here. No, then I thank you for the kind presentation, and we move to our next presenter, who will be Péter Batáry from Lendület Landscape and Conservation Ecology Research Group Center for Ecological Research, Vácrátót, Hungary. And the topic will be, what did we learn from urban ecological meta-analysis? So it will be a good link to the former presentation. There was also meta-analysis included. Thank you. Peter, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So now you will listen about this interesting method, meta-analysis, and now I exclusively focus on the meta-analysis where our group is responsible. So I also don't think that I have to start with many details about urbanization process. Maybe as an extra information, currently 3% of Earth land surfaces is covered by some kind of urban area. And this was also mentioned that there are many different causes of urbanization. This is the most extreme form of habitat loss and habitat modification, degradation. We seal the former natural, semi-natural areas, which leads to habitat fragmentation. If you think, for example, on the hills in Budapest on the other side of the Danube, you can also see that on this example of the Gellert Hill. It leads to a changed hydrological connectivity and many different kinds of pollution, air, soil, water, light, noise, etc. Heat island was also mentioned by Veronika now. And this means altogether a stronger exposure to the other global drivers, think on climate change or invasion. So what are the consequences? In general, most studies observe a reduction of species richness when we go toward the city center. Some studies observe an increase in abundance of common birds or arthropods, and altogether an altered community composition, although some studies, as mentioned by Christina Theodorou, showed that this might be the last resort for or rescue for some species, saving their lives from the intensive agriculture. But we also should keep in mind that the urban footprint goes much beyond at much larger scale. Just think on what kind of food do you eat, where the food is coming from, and it means also changes, as emphasized by Veronika, that it means changes in behavior, physiology, morphology of city dwellers, and it also affects us as humans, so our social structure, intellectual physiology, health, and even morphology is changed. So now let's focus on this topic, and I show you this in a little didactic way. So what is this meta-analysis? Meta-analysis is basically a quantitative research synthesis where we analyze the results of a set of studies, and this is always embedded in a larger set of methods which is called systematic reviews. In systematic reviews, we systematically identify, evaluate, select, and synthesize all available high-quality research evidences. And this has always a questioning, and this question can be composed of 4 major components, what we call PICO and PICO elements. And in this first study, our population element and my interest was basically urban bird communities. And many studies compare, as showed before, the intervention and urban areas are compared, as in the previous studies, to rural or natural areas as a comparator. Or there are many different studies which use an exposure of urbanization gradient. Let's say the impervious sealed area or the population density of people and so on. And the outcome is what people typically measure. In the case of Veronika, this was some kind of fitness parameter or stress level of amphibians. In my case, the outcome was species richness and abundance of birds. And based on this, we posed this scientific question: how does the bird community change along an urbanization gradient? And in this kind of meta-analysis studies, you can always see, at least in a supplementary so-called prisma flow diagram, which is the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And this shows you how, when you search, how you landed in the basic data set what you could later on meta-analyze. So we started with 2 search engines, Web of Science and Scopus. We filtered out the duplicates, and there is a screening process at the title level and abstract level. And then you evaluate it much deeper at the full text filtering, where you have a so-called eligibility criteria and decide whether the study can be included or not. And in this study, we landed in 2 data sets, one for species richness and the other for abundance, for a different number of observations from different papers. And then you start with the very sweaty part, the data mining. And in this data mining, you collect the data to be able to calculate the effect size. Effect size is basically the statistical measure that portrays the degree to which a given event is present in the sample. So we are interested, not necessarily whether this effect is significant or not, but how strong or how weak it is. And with this calculation in effect size, we put all studies on the same scale. And in urbanization gradient studies, like on the scatter plot you can show in the middle with these red dots, we calculated the oldest or the first described effect size measure, the Pearson correlation coefficient. And this you can calculate from many different statistical measures like T or FAU or chi-square, what I guess many of you know quite well. In the other types of studies which have this kind of categorical comparison, like urban versus rural, we calculated this previously mentioned HSD, the standardized mean difference, and you can convert it, and as we did, we converted this also to Pearson R. So all studies were, all effect sizes were put on the same scale. And in meta-analysis, you can see always these forest plots. In forest plots, we show the major results, and this depicts basically the effects, the average estimated effect size together with the 95% confidence intervals. And if these confidence intervals do not bracket the 0, it means a significant effect as well. And on the left side, left forest plot, you can see when we come from the rural areas
through the suburban to the urban. As we expected, the species richness of birds is decreasing, whereas in case of abundance, we observed only a marginally significant but a slight increase in the number of birds, probably in generalist bird species, which can cope with the harsh environment of the cities. So this indirectly means a homogenization of bird communities in the cities. We also tested some kind of moderators, which are environmental variables. We just classified cities where from this data are originating in small or large, based on the cutoff value of 500,000 people. And we did not find basically difference between them. There was a slight tendency that smaller cities are more exposed to urbanization process for the birds, but no real difference between small and large. But the most interesting thing why this paper was accepted in this journal is that we also try to test nonlinear effects. So on these in this process, we divided the comparison whether it was compared between urban and suburban settings, or suburban versus rural, or suburban versus natural, as you can see in the upper forest plot. I translated it to understand it easier also to a bar plot on the right side. So in the right side, you can see in the middle the suburban areas, and I set it directly to 100%. And what we can see when we compare it to natural habitat, there is a decrease of species richness from natural to suburban habitat, but basically no real change between rural and suburban. But the strongest change is happening, the strongest decline of the bird species is happening when we really enter the city centers. This is not the case for the abundance. In the abundance, there is basically no difference between urban, suburban, and natural habitats, but it seems, and this suggests this increase from the rural to the suburban, that in rural, large-scale agriculture, intensive management, this is relatively empty of birds. So now I show you also shortly 4 other meta-analyses, only the main outcome. This next one was done by Tamás Lakatos, who is, by the way, my PhD student and sitting here in the room. And with him, we were interested whether urbanization support or filter these filter given traits. And what we can see that we found relatively few effects. Maybe in the for the nesting place, what you can see here in the second part of the forest plot, we can see that cavity nesting species are not really threatened by urbanization. It means that they still find in these parks and city center in the parks their nesting places, but some species, especially those nesting on the ground and needing intact grassy areas, are really threatened and are really negatively affected by urbanization. When we go a bit lower, you can see the foraging technique. Also here a trait from the top of the trees to the ground. So where do these different bird species are feeding, like this nice linnet shown on the right side. And we can see that especially those species are again disadvantaged, which are feeding on the ground, which are looking for, which are so-called ground gleaner. And then in the last case, where we've classified the species based on the trait diet, whether they are insectivorous, mixed diet, or granivorous, we expected that insectivores will be loser. This seems to be, although this was not significant, and we expected that those species which have mixed diet can cope relatively well with the urbanization, but again, granivores and possibly those feeding on different grass seeds are again losers. Now we switch to another interesting meta-analysis study done by Dan Chamberlain from the University of Turin. And with him and some South African colleagues, we investigated the so-called luxury effect. This luxury effect states that there is a positive association between biodiversity and socio-economic status in urban areas. So to understand it better, richer areas in cities are greener. Also, if you take a look at on Budapest, on the Buda Hills, you see much more green areas where rich people live, I suppose, comparing to poorer areas within our capital. And this means an environmental injustice and a social inequity. And we posed some hypotheses and expected that there are some moderators which are affecting this luxury effect. So it can be more pronounced in areas where water is limited, so in drier countries or drier cities. It can be more pronounced in developing countries where there is a big difference between rich and poor, like South Africa is the most extreme, you know, or it is stronger for exotic compared to native species. And again, here you can see the forest plot on the left side, and on the upper side, this overall effect means that indeed, based on our meta-analysis, there is a so-called luxury effect. We didn't find a difference between rich and poor, although for rich it was significant, the luxury effect, for poor countries not. And when you consider the taxonomy group, this effect was only significant for plants, which is the most studied groups in urban ecology, by the way. But we found a very strong difference between the origin of the species, whether they are exotic species or native. The luxury effect was true for exotic species. It means that in richer areas we have many ornamental and also many exotic non-native, especially plant species. But the most interesting finding of the study can be seen on this scatter plot in the middle. And there was a so-called moderation effect of precipitation. So on the left side of this scatter plot, you can see that this luxury effect is especially expressed in drier cities, drier regions. This means an environmental injustice, and this may be more amplified in the future with the ever-increasing climate change. So what we should think on how we can manage and provision more water in a way that we prioritize the native vegetation and not the exotic one. And the next urbanization study was done by Dávid Korányi from my group. He is especially interested in biological control. And here we investigated and performed 3 meta-analyses. On the left forest plot, you can see the abundance of herbivores, so basically pest species. There were some positive effects, especially on sap feeders. When you think on aphids, so aphids are supported by urbanization, more and more aphids toward the city center. And in the middle, you can see the abundance of their natural enemies who are preying on the different pests. We found some losers, especially poor disperser natural enemies seem to be disadvantaged. And all in all, we showed on the right side that there is an overall negative effect of urbanization. So urbanization hampers biological pest control in general. And the last meta-analysis what I want to show again from our research group by Borbála Szabó. With her, we focused on soil fauna. On the left side, you can see the forest plot of abundance. On the right side, on the species richness. So we found some positive effect on given groups in case of abundance, and a couple of negative effects on species richness, depending whether which taxonomy group or based on their mobility, etc. But the most interesting finding is again shown on this scatter plot. And it's similar like in the paper of Dan Chamberlain, that there was a moderation effect of annual precipitation. So on this artistic, little artistic scatter plot, you can see that if we are in a so-called drier city, then this urbanization has even a positive effect. And we think that this is because of irrigation in these cities in contrast to the wet cities where we have losers. So as a take-home message or conclusion, I think that there are various direct and indirect drivers of urbanization, and disentangling their relative effects would be the next important step forward. These effects cause changes in various facets of biodiversity, as we already saw today, genetic, species, functional, and beyond. More mechanistic studies would be desirable. Meta-analysis is slowly there, with the coming more and more data that we can make much more complex meta-analysis, as I could show you now. So this is maybe the future. And there are various possibilities for mitigating urbanization effects, such as green infrastructure and thinking on how they are connected with corridors, and testing their ecological and socio-economic effectiveness is an important next challenge. And with the picture of my colleagues, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the kind presentation, Peter, and we have time for questions. Okay, first, Carlo. Yeah.
Hi. This is a kind of question that I ask to myself more than to everybody. So, in this kind of studies, when you speak about cities, okay, you don't distinguish between different kinds of cities probably, but each one of us has a different idea of a city. Probably we, as Europeans, have more or less the same idea of city, of urban structure, and so on. But in different parts of, for example, I can imagine in the US Midwest or in Nairobi, so cities are very different in their structure. How does this, how does this affect these kind of results? I was thinking, for example, about social justice and injustice, because in different urbanization types, probably you have very different levels of, let's say, social apartheid between different groups and so on.
Thank you. So there are certainly differences among these different cities that we included. Meta-analysis is basically an analysis of heterogeneity to see the heterogeneity between these cities. This is a good point that you mentioned, that European cities are different of on the other continents, because most of them are older and we have many new cities, like you think on Brisbane in Australia, etc. So we haven't considered this kind of differences, but urbanization is happening now very fastly in the developing world, and I think such studies that Veronika did, these could, so there the species couldn't still adapt, so I guess and I can imagine that we could also see, show the differences in community composition or structure when we would differentiate new cities with old cities, or very fast urban sprawling in the developing countries.
Okay, thank you. There is another question.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting to see in your last study that you shown a graph that urbanization can actually promote biodiversity, especially in dry regions. So I was wondering if you consider that this could have been driven by exotic species. Idea came into my mind that, for example, there could be parrot population that has escaped and established populations in these arid regions, as well as can be seen in European cities. So did you consider this native, non-native species for the biodiversity?
In this study we haven't considered. What is obvious, if you are a soil ecologist, you sample there where the soil is still wet and not completely dried. And I can imagine that invasion of soil animals is far not as controlled as or known as in plants or birds, let's say. So I can imagine that there could be also an effect of invasive animals as well. So I can imagine that. Because we very often transplant
yes.
plants.
This was my idea too.
Yeah.
Yes, so with pots one can just put it in the garden and can establish a population. So this can be, this not can necessarily a positive effect, I can imagine. Okay.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have also a question. Yeah, there was another question over there. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation, Peter. The last conclusion on your last slide said that there is one of the next research agendas could focus on trying to understand the biodiversity impacts of various green infrastructure and natural infrastructure type measures in cities. And I mean, we know that's a very broad category, but there is a subcategory that is also still very broad, urban rewilding. And I wonder if you think that's defined well enough, and whether that shows the way for how some of this urban natural infrastructure could be developed, and whether that might, are there so many indications that this is actually starting to have, or could have a positive effect?
Thank you. I think it depends on the social acceptance, first of all, of urban rewilding, and it depends how wide you want to do and how deep you want to go. And I think here in Eastern Europe we have to start with small steps in this direction. Because there is a high fear of people just when you think on ticks and something like that. So our next research, what we want to start is focusing, like Christina in the beginning showed, some kind of flower strips, and the acceptance here in Budapest, for example, is still not so high. So, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Are there further questions? Okay, then I will ask mine. So I would like to play a bit a devil's advocate and ask, so in my field of restoration ecology, most of the restoration studies which are involved in the meta-analysis were made in Western Europe or in the USA. So how high is in such urban studies the Western perspective?
I think I can imagine that the Western perspective is there, but this is maybe much easier to transplant than the so-called agricultural schemes in agroecology, because urban areas are relatively homogenized, and this Western perspective is coming from basically from the developed north in the temperate zone. So I don't think that we would make big mistakes testing and copying and adjusting it, at least here in our Eastern European areas.
Okay, thank you. If there are no further questions, then thank you for the presentation, and we will move forward to the next presentation by Béla Tóthmérész, University of Debrecen Department of Ecology, Debrecen, Hungary. The title of the presentation is Urban Biodiversity and the Urban Homogenization Hypothesis. Okay, Béla, you have the floor.
Thanks, Peter. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to speak about urban biodiversity, especially focusing on the soil fauna, really biodiversity of carabid beetles. And also would like to speak about testing the homogenization hypothesis, which is a popular topic nowadays, actually a kind of buzzwords. So let's see it. Just like everybody was speaking a little bit about that, urbanization is a leading process on the globe, and evidently it causes a massive loss of habitats. But at the same time, a variety of new habitats are created in the urban environment. Although from ecological point of view, it's rather questionable what is the value of these new kind of habitats. So there are contradicting arguments regarding the processes behind the so-called behind the urbanization, which is a general idea anyway from ecological point of view. During my talk, I'm focusing on the GlobeNet Worldwide Research Project, which the focus of this project was to explore the effect of soil fauna, effect of urbanization on the soil fauna along an urban gradient. to see just a very simple demonstration of the finding of the Hungarian GlobeNet project. In a GlobeNet project, usually there are 3 steps, an urban, suburban, and a rural site. And the lines of the table, the first line is the number of species, the second one is the Shannon diversity, the third one is the Simpson diversity, and finally the last line, the red one, is the number of individuals trapped during the study. Actually, the diversities are expressed as an effective number of species, or equivalent number of species, if you prefer. But anyway, the conclusion is very clear. There is a huge number of species in the urban area, 33, which is roughly double or 2/3 of the species richness of the suburban and rural area, which is evidently a kind of contradiction. But you can see the same conclusion with this rainy diversity, which is a scale-dependent characterization of the communities. So just looking at the traditional ecological textbook, we know that the species richness of the natural area should be the highest one. Here, this one is the smallest one. But if you just try to find the tricky theory, you can argue with the intermediate disturbance hypothesis that if you regard the urbanization or the suburban area as an intermediate disturbed area, the suburban area should be the most diverse, but actually that's not the case. Quite surprisingly, the urban area is the most diverse, and actually the diversity of the urban area is extremely high to the 2 other ones. Okay, just try to find the reasons behind this picture. If you look at these Venn diagrams, you can see that the number of those species, okay, here 19 in the middle. So there were 19 species, which probably forest adapted species, because these are forested areas, forest adapted species, which were present both in the urban, suburban, and rural area. And if you look at the other parts of the Venn diagrams, you can see that, let's say this one here, rural especially species which were present only in the rural area was only 2, roughly the same picture for the suburban area. But the reason of the extremely high number of species, that on the suburban area there were a tremendous lot of species which were present only in the urban area. Just to try to quantify another way, using these kind of habitat affinity indices, let's say just to give a score for the species, 1 for those species which are especially adapted to the environment, so those species which should be there, and just go down, and the opposite end is the -1 for those species which are generalist or ubiquitous or open habitat species which should not be there, just indicating something damage of the environment. So if you look at these histograms, clearly demonstrating the same pattern like the Venn diagrams, there are four subfigures, but the difference is only the different kind of weighting. So these are all the same habitat affinity values. So you can see that the urban is full of generalist species and open habitat species invading the area, and there is a kind of gradient towards the rural area. So, before we go further, there were 9 countries worldwide in the GlobeNet project: Belgium, Bulgaria, Canada, Denmark, England, Finland, Hungary, Japan, and Romania. If you look at the pattern of forest species, so those species which are particularly adapted to the studied habitat, the picture is very, very similar worldwide. The number of forest species higher everywhere than the in the rural area. Only there are two lines here. The red one is the rural, and the green one is the rural, and the red one is the urban area. So if you look at those species which should be there, so the forest species, it is evident that the rural area is more species rich than the rural one, and that's a general picture worldwide. Okay, so just based on these preliminary dates, we can look at the homogenization hypothesis. First of all, it is a hot topic, and it is a real buzzword, but there are substantial shifts in the various form of the homogenization hypothesis. First of all, we can speak about urban homogenization hypothesis, but frequently this is a very, very general hypothesis, even speaking about the settlements all around the world, saying that there are same kind of houses, same kind of road structure, and so on. So this is a very general statement, just partly focusing on the plants and animals. Frequently we speak about biotic homogenization. So this is a bit more focused on the plants and animals, but frequently it is a general statement, not about urbanization, but a general statement about the homogenization of the living communities living in the urban area or agrarian area or everywhere else. And finally, we used to speak about urban biotic homogenization, which is especially focusing on the homogenization process going through the urban area. But even the situation is ambiguous here, because there are two versions of the urban biotic homogenization. One of them is speaking about that means that the communities become increasingly similar worldwide. So that's a spatial, and sometimes they say that become increasingly similar over time. So that's a temporal variation. And the temporal and the spatial variation is very different from ecological point of view. Even it looks very similar, there is just one word difference, but from ecological point of view, the difference is much higher. So, my proposal is at least that we should speak about a strong, a medium, and a weak version of the homogenization hypothesis. The strong version is the spatial version. It says that the same species can be found in the large cities all over the world, okay? So that's probably that's based on the simple idea of a tourist, that if you are in New York or Budapest or Berlin, you can find pigeons everywhere, okay? So that's the basic idea. Huge cities are very similar over the world, and you can find the same species over there. That's a trade-based version. You can argue that it's a medium version, but maybe better to see it's a trade-based version. So the cities provide uniform environment, and this means that the species with similar traits become frequent in the cities. Although if you would like to test it on your data sets, still you may argue whether you are using the narrow definition of the trait or the general idea behind of the traits, because you may get a different conclusion. And the weak version, that's the temporal version of the statement. It says that the replacement of local habitat-specific species, the weak version is about the replacement of local habitat-specific species by generalist ubiquitous species. So it means that in the urban area, the generalist species are overcompeting those species which are especially adapted to the environment because of those changes caused by the urbanization, like the heat urban effect and other kind of effects, or the water shortage or water surplus and many other things which is characteristic for the cities. Okay, biotic homogenization hypothesis. This should be the prediction for the 9 studied countries. If the strong version is true, you should receive such kind of conclusion based on the data sets. So the urban area of the country 1 should be more similar to the urban area of the country 2, because the same species are characteristic for the cities, and again the rural area should be similar to the other country. Okay, so that's the classification of the 9 countries. This one is the overseas countries: Japan urban and Japan rural, Canada rural and Canada urban. That's one, the southeastern European countries, or the continental climate, if you prefer. That includes Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Finland. Oh, sorry, that's another side of the business. So Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. And that's one, the northwest European countries, or if you prefer, the oceanic climate. That include Finland, England, Denmark, and Belgium. So that means that the strong version of the biotic homogenization hypothesis is definitely false, even if you argue that there are a few species which are invading the cities in each continent. And of course, you may find other examples like isopods, which moved by the soil and able to survive in the greenhouses of the large cities, and so on and so on. But still, as a general statement, the strong version of the biotic homogenization is definitely false, because the biogeographical determination of the species pool is more influential than the effect of urbanization. The weak version looks true for the Hungarian side and also for the other 9 countries, which means that generalist ubiquitous species invading these urban habitats and overcompeting the other species, at least in abundance. So that's the final conclusion, that the total number of species significantly increased in the urban area, resulted in by the invasion of generalist and ubiquitous species. So that means that evidently there are 2 components of this process. One of them is the increased number of generalist species, and also the decrease of those species which are adapted to the habitats. And there is a kind of balance between these two opponent process, but each of them result in a kind of homogenization. So this means that the weak version of the homogenization hypothesis for the soil fauna at least looks true. Okay, and these are the papers we have published these findings. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and there we have time for questions. Yeah, Peter.
Thank you for this interesting talk. In this GlobeNet dataset, you use different countries, so space for time. Are you aware of studies showing this really temporal effect, or do you know, or do you see in your many different studies these temporal effect in homogenization? Let's say in your different studies in Debrecen with these 20 years of different urbanization research.
Yes, definitely, but this kind of temporal decrease of the habitat-specific species and increase the generalist species is resulted in by the human activity. So that is not because of the time goes on, but because the human activity is increasing. Let's say in the studied area there are clear-cut areas, so that means that clearly there is a strong invasion of the open habitat species. Of course, when the shrubs goes up, there is a kind of mitigation, but you lose the very specialized species. So as the time goes on, you just lose another species from the species pool which is adapted to the environment.
Okay. Further questions? I have a question. So you have spoken about in the conclusion about the weak hypothesis and the strong, but what about the medium?
Yes, that's a good question. Because maybe the medium is not the best name, because that's a trade-based hypothesis, and that's another buzzword, but I'm quite optimistic regarding the trade-based analysis. I'm a bit skeptical regarding the homogenization hypothesis. I mean, that's a good homogenization is an important idea, but that's, in that form it's very, very general, so we should be focusing more clearly the special versions of the homogenization hypothesis. Trade-based analysis is okay, but unfortunately I have no real useful information regarding the findings in trade-based analysis, because trade-based idea is, well, relatively new, so there is not many published, at least I do not know many published findings regarding the trade-based analysis of the process, but I think it would be quite useful.
Not an easy answer as for example for the other two, because in terms of what traits you make the study. Okay, thank you. Are there further questions? If not, then I thank you for your presentation, and we are moving now to our last presenter, Ernő Vince, who is, I hope, online with us.
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Okay, hello, now I see you. Okay, so Ernő Vince, Department of Biology, Lund University, Lund, Sweden, ELKH-PE, Evolutionary Ecology Research Group, Center for Natural Sciences, University of Pannonia, Veszprém, Hungary. He will talk about urbanization effects on the cognitive abilities and behavior of birds. Ernő, you have the floor.
Can you see the screen I shared? Yeah, I'm going to start. Can you see the slideshow?
Now I see.
Great. So my talk will also be more about urbanization's effects on the individual level on animals rather than on the community level, specifically how urbanization shapes their cognitive abilities. We already heard a bit about today we already heard a little bit about how urbanization changes the environment of birds and what kind of environmental challenges they meet. For example, the environmental stress is higher in urban habitats. This includes light pollution, noise, air pollution, as well as increased human disturbance. And also the available diet is very different in an urban habitat compared to a natural habitat. A lot of the food items, for example, insects, might be less abundant in urban areas compared to more natural or rural areas. However, urban habitats also provide a lot of novel resources. Bird feeders are a classic example, but also a lot of other type of anthropogenic resources that they can access. Cognition, one definition for cognition is that it's the ability to obtain and process environmental information, which the animal can then use to organize or modify its behavior in an adaptive way. And cognition is very helpful for animals when they face novel environmental challenges by providing various behavioral innovations they can use to access these novel resources. And urban habitats are full of these kind of novel environmental challenges. And there have been many reports of birds showing innovative behavior in urban environments. A classic case is the in England, when milk used to be delivered in these bottles that were covered in aluminum foil. Some blue tits and later also some great tits learned how to open this aluminum foil and access the cream on top of the milk. Somewhat similarly, in Australia, sulfur-crested cockatoos learned how to open these trash cans, how to remove the lid of the trash cans and access the food inside. The last case I'm showing here is even more cognitively challenging because it requires cooperation between the birds. So on this water fountain, if one pigeon sits on the handle, then the water stream will start, and then the other pigeons can access the water. But it requires more reciprocity between the birds so that all of them can access the water. So when comparing urban and rural populations, here I'm using rural in the broad sense, referring to both agricultural or natural areas. When comparing these populations, one would expect that urban animals would be better in performing all sorts of cognitive tasks, particularly because in these anthropogenic environments, there could be a strong selection pressure for innovativeness. However, the picture is not clear because urbanization also means greater extent of stress, and also lack of natural resources can lead to worse physiological condition in urban animals. And some studies suggest that these kind of stress and weak condition can hinder cognitive development and will actually reduce the cognitive abilities of urban birds compared to their rural conspecifics. A handful of studies have been performed comparing urban and rural populations of birds, of this. The first such study, which compared problem-solving ability between urban and rural house sparrows, was done partly by Veronika, who talked earlier today. And it was published in 2009. And since then, similar studies have been performed in mynas, in different species of finches, tits, and also one species of raptor. And these studies not only found not only differences between urban and some of them found strong differences between urban and rural populations. Others found no significant difference. And interestingly, not only between species there was a big variation, but also within species. So the same species in the same species, in some tasks, urban birds might have outperformed rural birds. In other tasks, urban birds and rural birds showed similar performance. And there were even a few studies where the rural birds outperformed the urban birds. I'm going to show two examples of such experiments that I was involved in. So this one was done back in Hungary. In this study, in this study, the entrance of the nest box of the great tit was covered by this feather that was stuck there with magnets. And the bird has to figure out how to remove this feather and enter the nest box to feed its nestlings. And in this study, urban birds showed much better performance compared to the rural birds, both in the proportion of birds that managed to solve the task and in the speed of solving latency. In this other study, which I did in Sweden, also on great tits, the task was to open this tube that is covered by a cotton ball. It's plugged, and by pulling out the plug, the bird can access the food inside. And in this one, we found no significant difference between urban and rural birds. The proportion of successful solving and also the solving latencies were very similar between the birds from the two habitat types. Because of these this big variation in results, I performed a meta-analysis with my colleague Béla Kovács. Péter already introduced us to the concept of how these meta-analyses work. In this one, we looked at studies that compared problem-solving success specifically between urban and rural conspecifics in 11 species, which include the 8 aforementioned bird species, as well as 3 mammal species. And here, we found that when we compare the problem-solving latency of urban and non-urban populations, the standardized mean in this meta-analysis was not significantly different from 0, which in practice means that that overall there was no robust difference between urban and rural birds in their problem-solving abilities, birds and mammals. But we found quite a large heterogeneity in the study. So the variation between the results was much higher than we would expect from a random distribution, which suggests that indeed there is a really big variation between various species and various tasks in their problem-solving abilities. So what could cause this high heterogeneity? One explanation I already mentioned in the introduction. So there could be various mechanisms that that might be affecting the problem-solving ability of these urban animals in different ways. So it's possible that, for example, in some populations, the selection pressure for innovativeness is higher. And because of that, these urban animals show better cognitive abilities compared to their rural conspecifics. But it's possible that in other populations, they might be more sensitive to these environmental stress and might be, and because of that, they might show weaker cognitive abilities compared to the rural birds. Additionally, another factor that we should consider is the history of populations of these urban bird populations. In a population that recently colonized urban habitats, the environment is very novel. The animals encounter a lot more novel challenges. And because of that, there could be a much stronger selection for innovation and behavioral flexibility. And this ultimately could lead to a bigger difference between the urban animals and their rural conspecifics. But if the urban population has been established for a long time, then the environment is no longer novel. And therefore, the selection for innovation and behavioral flexibility might be a lot weaker. And that in turn means that the difference between urban and rural animals in their problem-solving abilities might be negligible. And finally, this idea was already mentioned earlier at this Congress. Urbanization is not a binary category. So the urbanization is a continuous gradient, and the relationship between urbanization and cognition might be nonlinear. And since most of these studies use the binary urban versus rural category, depending on which specific level of urbanization were their urban area and their rural area, the outcome also might have been very different. So altogether, it seems that despite the benefits of good cognitive abilities in urban habitats, there is no consistent difference between urban and rural animals in their cognitive abilities. However, there are really heterogeneous results, which might be explained by mechanisms with opposing effects, but also by the history of population and a possible nonlinear relationship between cognition and urbanization. And with that, I would like to thank all my colleagues, both in Veszprém and in Lund, who were involved in these studies. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the nice presentation, and we have time for questions. Okay, Veronika.
Hi, Erno, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, because your voice broke up at the end of your presentation. So I was thinking another obvious reason for the heterogeneity could be methodological heterogeneity. And did you try to look at like the overall percentage of successful individuals? Maybe that could be an indication of task difficulty. Because I was thinking that the example that you showed with the graded, it showed that maybe the differences can only be detected if the task is difficult enough. So you could use a task difficulty as a moderator in your analysis. Did you try to do that, or was it not easy to do?
So in the meta-analysis itself, it was not, we didn't use any of these moderators because of the fairly low sample size, but basically I agree that task difficulty might play a role. However, in this specific study on the same individual birds where I showed this plug opening task, we also did a much more difficult task with a lower solving success. Instead of this 70%, the solving success was around only 50%. and there we also did not detect any kind of difference between urban and rural populations. But there is definitely, methodological differences can definitely also play a role in here.
Thanks.
Okay, further questions? Yep.
Hello, Erno. It's nice to see you online at least. It was an interesting study, and regarding one of your potential explanations was that maybe the urban birds originated from different spots along the urban gradient, yet classed as urban. So this could have been the source of the heterogeneity, as I gathered. So I was wondering if there was roughly 15 to 20 studies, I can't remember, so not that much. Couldn't you think about that? Maybe you could re-evaluate the urbanization for all these studies, because I assume that they provided the GPS coordinates for the birds that they were collected, so you could, in a standard way, evaluate urbanization in a way you prefer. So that could have been a standard, and you could use this as a moderator in the analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there are definitely further moderators that one can look at in this meta-analysis, and indeed this urbanization gradient is one of them. So scoring what either including some kind of categorization or a continuous variable. Yes, and this could be only just one factor that could cause this big variation, of course, and it might interact with other factors, for example, the diet of the animals or the other ecological parameters as well. So if we had more data, if we had a more robust sample, here it was 20 effect sizes, then it would be definitely interesting to look at more moderators and check the effect of urbanization gradient, but also other ecological parameters.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there further questions? If not, I thank you for the presentation. And now we are moving to our last program point, and I ask Péter Batáry to say some closing remarks to the session.
Thank you. I think it was a very nice session where we had diverse topics, a perfect sex ratio with a complete gender balance with 5 great women scientists, and we learned from different case studies, originating a bit biased toward terrestrial, but we had also some aquatic studies, some behavioral, evolutionary, and again a bit biased toward community ecology. What we learned is that urbanization has sometimes positive, but mostly negative effects, especially if we look at on given specialist species group, it filters different traits. And there are options, mostly at the moment in Western Europe or so, for different kind of mitigation actions, or maybe so-called urban environmental schemes, which we should more and more consider, involving the social scientists to make it in an equitable way. And with that, I want to thank all presenters for their great talk, and also in the online space, and also the patience of the audience here, and also in the online space. And with that, I finally want to thank the Accademia Europea Budapest Knowledge Hub for supporting this workshop, and also the Hungarian Academy of Sciences to give us this nice place to be able to do it in this very prestigious, nice building. With that, I close this session, and thank you very much again.